Sienna God, hello all. Good afternoon, Wado. Thank you for watching. This is day 16 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. The Washington School Board in the 1950s had included a very militant and distinguished black woman named Margaret Just Butcher. So that's Margaret excuse me, if you want to look her up, who was also a graduate of Dunbar High School. Surely Dr. Butcher had not let all this happen without exercising her well-known gifts of withering criticism. Yet I looked in vain through the minutes of the school board meetings for even a single sentence by anybody expressing any concern whatever about, I thought it was whatsoever, but anyway, any concern whatever about the fate of Dunbar High School under the new reorganization plan. Finally, in complete frustration and bewilderment, I phoned Dr. Butcher herself and asked, was there anything that was said off the record about Dunbar that did not find its way into the minutes that I had read? Quote unquote, no, she replied. Then she reminded me that racial, quote unquote, integration, was the battle cry of the hour in the 1950s. No one thought about what would happen to black schools, not even Dunbar. So you hear how everybody says that, oh, they didn't want us in their schools and all this other kind of stuff. Well, they don't know their own history, because literally people were better off segregated. Okay? I'm not trying to be weird, not trying to be funny, not trying to have like some sort of conspiracy theory type thing or anything. I'm telling you, the numbers, they don't freaking lie, dude. And the reason why I'm telling you that they don't lie is because there's no discrepancies within the numbers. As you've seen with Dunbar High School, it wasn't just Dunbar though. It was other school systems. They were doing very, very well. They had people of like their own nationality or what have you, their own race, going up through the system, coming back to teach their own, working extra because they saw what was happening with their students. They were excelling and growing and learning, and it was incredible for them, truly rewarding, and they were delaying their retirement because of it. It wasn't like what you see nowadays where people are so extremely taxed and they're underpaid, they're overworked, and nobody is taking accountability for their children acting like heathens, okay? So they're doing good if they can just barely get the people to pass the minimum, right? It wasn't like that at all before segregation, right? Including family units together, supporting one another, making sure that their kids were, attending school. There were repercussions and things for them. As you noted in the census and stuff that they took, like within the school, who was working what, they only had one doctor. The rest were janitors and like something else, right? So like, I don't know, bus drivers or something. But I'm saying there was, the vast majority was janitors, something else, and then, labor workers, janitors, and one doctor. There might have been another number in there, but my point is they were all hardworking, coming from hardworking families, two-parent households and stuff. So quit believing the frickin' hype. That's clickbait, okay? It's not real. Anyway. Now, decades later, we still do not have racial integration in many of the urban schools around the country, and we also do not have Dunbar High School. Such are the ways of politics, where the crusade of the hour often blocks out everything else, at least until another crusade comes along and takes over the same monopoly of our minds. Ironically, black high schools in Washington today have many of the so-called quote-unquote prerequisites for good education that never existed during the heyday of Dunbar High School. Now remember, in yesterday's reading, it said that people who went through Dunbar, they had such a great reputation for pumping out well-educated people that they didn't even have to. If you had Dunbar High School as your place where you graduated, like as on your diploma, you got in to Harvard, Stanford, whatever it was, without even having to apply, honey. You know what I mean? That long essay and all that kind of stuff, and go through the rigmarole, the come in and let's talk to you, or whatever it is, all the hoops they have the kids jump through now, right? They didn't have to do any of that. It's like, oh, you're automatic in. You want to come on? Come on, right? We're waiting for you. We knew about you anyway. So you're already on our list of acceptance without even applying, right? Anyway, and yet the educational results are abysmal. Quote unquote adequate funding is always included among these quote unquote prerequisites, and today the per pupil expenditure in the District of Columbia is amongst the highest in the nation, while its test scores are among the lowest. Think about that. And it's not just in the District of Columbia, right? It's literally everywhere. We are the most in as far as expenses is in education and health, right? But we are the sickest country, as well as not the dumbest, but we're kind of working on it, aren't we? And it's not funny, but it's funny. You know what I mean? Like, it's funny because it's freaking ridiculous. Anyhow, all this freaking money is being blown on what? Jeepers. That needs to be exposed, let me tell you. During the years of Dunbar's success, it was starved for funds, and some of its classes had more than 40 students. As a failing ghetto school today, Dunbar has a finer physical plant than it ever had when it was an academic success. Make that make sense, right? Are you spending those funds and bringing the best teachers in to whip the school into shape? Just asking. You're not doing it, because they were doing more back in the day with way less, completely underfunded. Because I'm going to tell you, if the people absolutely love what they're doing and they can see real change in real time, right? And have these like people come back and just like can like thank them for helping them become a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever it is. Thank you, Mrs. Whatever, Mr. Whatever, right? Anyway, they did it. But now it's just like, where's the money at? Because you hear that the teachers are getting paid a pittance, and then they're using part of their penance or whatever you say, to buy school supplies and stuff for those who are less fortunate or whatever it is. But you would think they'd be using some of those funds, because they're highly funded, right? They'd be using some of those funds for school supplies for the kids. I'm just saying. As a failing ghetto school today, Dunbar has a finer physical plant than it ever had when it was an academic success. Politics is also part of this picture. Immediate, tangible symbols are what matter within the limited time horizon of elected politicians. Throwing money at public schools produces such symbolic results, even if it cannot produce a quality education. The aftermath of the decline and academic collapse of Dunbar High School is also revealing. With a new school building, the question arose as to the disposition of the original building. Dunbar alumni wanted that building preserved as some sort of memorial to an historic achievement, but Washington's political leaders, representing the kind of people who had not gone to Dunbar, were bitterly opposed. This became a heated legal issue, fought all the way up to the federal circuit court of appeals. After the political leaders won in court, one of them spoke for those, in quotes, who say that the school represents a symbol of an elitism among blacks that should never happen again. I say we should razz it, R-A-Z-E, raise, that would be R-A-I, I don't know, razz it, end quote. They did. The dog and the manager triumphed once more. Washington Post columnist William Raspberry, like the fruit, summarized the conflicting feelings about Dunbar High School and the black community when he wrote, "Fill a room with middle-aged blacks who grew up in Washington, mention the word, quote-unquote, Dunbar, and then take cover. That one word will divide the room into two emotion-charged, outraged, warring factions, those who did and those who didn't attend Dunbar High School," end quotes, when it was Dunbar, end quote. Despite the Supreme Court's pronouncement in the historic 1954 case of Brown versus Board of Education that racially separate schools, end quotes, are inherently unequal, end quote, there have been many predominantly or wholly minority schools whose test scores were at or above the national average. The average IQ at Dunbar High School was 111 in 1939 and again in 1950. Ironically, Dunbar was within walking distance of the Supreme Court, which in effect declared its existence impossible. However, it was not the only black school of which this was true, much less the only minority school, for there have also been all Chinese American schools and at least one all American Indian school which have done the same. Many, if not most predominantly minority schools, have performed very poorly, but enough others have not that this cannot be blamed simply on their being racially segregated schools. Not only did M Street Dunbar High School have a racially segregated student body throughout the 85 years of its academic success, so did Augustine School, a Catholic school in New Orleans, which also met national standards in its early history. The first black student from the South to win a National Merit Scholarship came from St. Augustine. So did the first presidential scholar of any race from the state of Louisiana. When St. Augustine was studied back in the 1970s, 20% of all presidential scholars in the history of the state had come from this one school, with about 600 black students. Test scores were never used as a rigid cutoff for admission to St. Augustine. There were students with IQs in the 60s, as well as students with IQs more than twice that high. Moreover, the average IQ of the school as a whole rose over the years, being in the 80s and 90s in the 1950s, and then reaching the national average of 100 in the 1960s. To put that in perspective, both blacks and whites in the South during this era tended to score below the national average on IQ and other standardized tests. By contrast, with a private Catholic school like St. Augustine, PS 91 in Brooklyn, New York, was a public elementary school located in a rundown ghetto and housed in an even older building than the original Dunbar High School. Yet the students in most of the grades in this predominantly black school scored at or above the national norms on standardized tests when I studied it back in the 1970s. It was the only school in its district whose students were reading at or above the national average. The next best school in that district had fewer than 40% of its students reading at or above national norms, and a number of other schools in the district had fewer than 30% who reached that level. This was not in any sense a middle-class school or a magnet school. It was just an ordinary ghetto school run by an ordinary principal. What was more extraordinary to me than even the test scores of the students was the openness with which I was welcomed and allowed to see whatever I wanted to see. Educators often like to give guided tours to selected, and then in parentheses, and often atypical, close parentheses, places, much like the Potemkin Potemkin village tours in Tsarist Russia. But in PS 91, I was allowed to wander down the halls and arbitrarily pick out which classrooms I wanted to go into. I did this on every floor of the school. Inside those classrooms were black children, much like children you could find in any ghetto across the country. Many came from broken homes and were on welfare. Yet inside the school, they spoke in grammatical English, in complete sentences. They spoke regular, like not ghetto or whatever, right? Because I was like reading that, I thought, does it sound like incomplete? But it's complete sentences, okay? Because it literally says incomplete sentences. But anyway, and to the point. Many of the materials they were studying were a year or more ahead of their respective grade levels, which is really good. None of these successful schools had a curriculum especially designed for blacks. Most had some passing recognition of the children's backgrounds. Dunbar High School, for example, was named for black poet Paul Laurence, Laurenc, Dunbar, and it set aside one day a year to commemorate Frederick Douglass. I just tripped all over it. Anyway, Frederick Douglass, but its curriculum could hardly be called Afrocentric. As Senator Edward Brooke, so remember, they didn't designate an entire month for Black History or whatever, right? They had one day where they spoke about Frederick Douglass. And the name Paul Lawrence Dunbar, Dunbar being the name of the school that they decided to take. But anyways, because it was like M High School or something like that. But its curriculum could hardly be called Afrocentric. As Senator Edward Brooke, B-R-O-K-E, a Dunbar alumnus, put it, Negro History Week was observed. Oh, here you go. And in American history, they taught about the emancipation of slaves and the struggle for equality and civil rights. But there was no demand by students for more, no real interest in Africa and its heritage. We knew about Africa as we knew about Finland, as it should be, okay? Throughout the 85 years of its academic success, Dunbar High School taught Latin. In some of the early years, it taught Greek as well. Its whole focus was on expanding the students' cultural horizons, not turning their minds inward. Still less was its focus on giving students a sense of victimhood or of closed doors. That's great. Though, in fact, many doors were closed to them throughout the history of Dunbar's academic success. So it says, still less was it focused on giving students a sense of victimhood or of closed doors, though in fact many doors were closed to them throughout the history of Dunbar's academic success. On the other hand, many Dunbar alumni were the first to open some of those doors. Very cool. Instead of today's fashionable focus on grievances, the tone was set by a poem on the assembly wall written by Paul Lawrence Dunbar, for whom the school was named. Its first stanza said, "Keep a plugging away. Perseverance still is king. Time it's sure." Sorry, I'm trying to hurry because my son's Transformers episode is fixing to wrap up, and I was like, "Yeah, do that while I'm doing this. I'm gonna hurry real fast. Then after that, you can play while I do my other one." Anyway, keep a plugging away. Perseverance still is king. Time its sure reward will bring. Work and wait unwearying. Keep a plugging away. That's really cool. This was written at a time when racial segregation and discrimination were pervasive across the South and were spreading into the North. When blacks were being lynched and when the very school in which these words were posted received less money than white schools in the same city. Many today might disdain this message of self-improvement as naive at best, but the fact is that it worked. And much that is considered more sophisticated today has a dismal record of failure. A particularly painful example of contemporary failure is this account of Dunbar High School in 1993. So fast forward to 1993. Rodney McDaniel is a senior at Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C. He's captain of the football team, which is the best in the city. Rodney McDaniel evidently has the ability to take harder courses than he does, but he, like other students at Dunbar, has been held to low standards by teachers unwilling or unable to demand more. A smaller percentage of Dunbar students go to college now than did 60 years ago. That's crazy. 60 years earlier would have been in the depths of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So how are they excelling in like worse conditions? You know what I mean? Harlem and the Lower East Side. Important as the history of outstanding schools for black students has been, there is also much to learn from the history of very ordinary urban ghetto schools, which often did far better in the past, both absolutely and relative to their white contemporaries, than is the case today. The test scores in ordinary Harlem schools in the 1940s were quite comparable to the test scores in white working class neighborhoods on New York's Lower East Side at that same time. Sometimes the Harlem schools scored a little higher, and sometimes the Lower East Side schools scored a little higher, but there were no such glaring racial disparities as we have become used to in urban schools in recent years. In April 1941, for example, some Lower East Side schools scored slightly higher on tests of word meaning and paragraph meaning than some schools in Harlem, but in tests given in December of that same year, several Harlem schools scored higher than the Lower East Side schools. Neither set of schools scored as high as the citywide average, though neither was hopelessly below it. While the Lower East Side of New York is justly known for the many people who were born in poverty there and rose to middle class levels and some to national prominence, very little attention is paid to a very similar history in Harlem during that era. Some years ago, a national magazine ran a flattering profile of me expressing wonder that I had come out of Harlem and gone on to elite colleges and an academic career. Shortly thereafter, I received a letter from a black lawyer of my generation pointing out that my experience was by no means so unusual in those days. He had grown up in Harlem during those same years, just a few blocks from me. Donde cogen que you in a good chance, get to me again, love you, mean it.